Good day, everyone, and welcome to the next session. My name is Menno Lamers. I'm the founder of PropTech For Good, and we empowering the real estate industry to innovate, to accelerate sustainable ambitions for a regenerative world. I'm looking forward today to talk about driving value for real estate property owners with PropTech. So really talking about the social impact of PropTech. And I would like to introduce you to all the other panelists. So please come and join me. Welcome, Michelle Killoran. She's the principal of OMERS Ventures. Welcome. Welcome, Gosselin. He's the Senior Director, Professional Services at BGIS. And welcome, Kevin, with a big challenging name, Teeroovengadum. I hope I said it right. Co-founder
it's
of
It's no more challenging.
Welcome. Curious to talk about the social impact of PropTech today at this event. Let's start. This summit is about driving value for real estate and property owners with PropTech. So about social impact of PropTech, and which major trends do you observe? Michelle, can I start with you?
Sure. Happy to. So my name is Michelle. I'm a principal at OMERS Ventures. So my role there is I lead all of our PropTech investing. So that's residential, commercial, or construction, series A, B, and C. So for us, some of the trends we've seen around owners and kind of the commercial real estate space, I would say the first one is ownership. Different ownership models of how to own buildings. This is interesting across residential real estate as well. But on the commercial side, we've seen some new movement around more fractionalized ownership and ways that you can own, say, a token of a building and give access to ownership of commercial real estate that maybe retail investors couldn't have. So we're excited about ownership. The second one is data access. There's a lot of data in commercial real estate that is not easily accessible to different parties. It's very siloed. I think we see that a lot in the transaction of leasing or purchasing real estate. So that's something I think we're hopeful for, and we're starting to see trends of data becoming more democratized. And then finally, I think the other trend that we're particularly excited about is just anything related to the new built world. So this means anything that improves construction workflows. So right now, I would say this industry is relatively low on the adoption curve of technology, but things are changing fast. People really had to embrace digital solutions the past couple of years. So we really are starting to see some of these really take off, and we're particularly excited about that.
Me too. When I listen to this, looking forward to see what's going to happen in the next period of time. Daniel, how do you see that? What are your trends? What do you observe from a BGIS perspective?
Well, thank you. So, as Menno mentioned, my name is Daniel. I work for BGIS. We're a large facility management company. We're global, based out of Canada. So we have a very large footprint in Canada, and growing in the United States, Europe, and Australia, New Zealand. So our day-to-day is really the operation of the buildings, including capital repairs and large projects and whatnot. So we deal with really procurement of technology throughout our business. And we do this on behalf of building owners. So we don't own our own buildings, we do it on behalf of building owners. Personally, I work on a very large federal account for the Canadian government, which has been exciting because there's been a lot of commitment towards transformation and innovation. In terms of the trends that we're seeing, and I'm seeing it very much in the federal government, but also outside. But the first one is sustainability, and that's been going on for the last 6 or 7 years with a very large focus on carbon emissions. So that's been my bread and butter, has been reduction of carbons in buildings, and we've developed a robust roadmap that is not only good for the environment, but also good fiscally. So we try to balance both, but we're really finding that it's very much possible to do. And I know there's a question later on about the value of buildings, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Health and wellness, with COVID hitting, even before that, there was a lot of trend on talking about health and wellness. One is on the mental health side of things, but also indoor air quality is really high priority. So we're seeing a big push on that. And then just to what Michelle talked about as well as digital data. So we're evolving, and some of it is quite straightforward, such as water leak detection. Property management, one of the biggest frustrations or challenges is flooding. And we found that very simple water leak detection system has been instrumental in saving hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, in damage. Energy management obviously is a big one. Preventative maintenance, occupancy is another one, because especially with the changes now, we don't know how the buildings are going to be used, and real estate owners need to know how to make decisions, and really getting anonymous. So really keep it private. You don't want to identify anyone, but we're using infrared and that kind of stuff. That's what we're seeing as a trend. But I think that's going to be a big one to optimize how buildings are used, and whether or not you can make real estate decisions like, should I own this building? Should I rent it out? Should I only keep 2 floors? And I think a lot of real estate owners have been running blind for a long time, and I think that has an impact on sustainability as well. Because if we have empty buildings that we're heating and cooling and emitting carbon emissions, that's not an effective use of our infrastructure. So those are the main ones that we've got. The other 2 are a little bit different, but there is also a big movement in Indigenous and social procurement to make sure that that all that it's an inclusive that procurement is inclusive, I should say.
Yeah, we will talk about that also a bit later. Of course, social procurement, very interesting trend in that way. I see it also in the Netherlands. I'm based in the Netherlands, but also having that global reach and global insights. Kevin, how do you what trends do you see from an African perspective, but maybe also a bit broader?
No, absolutely. I think what both Michelle and Daniel have been talking about is sort of interesting, because as they were sort of mentioning bits and pieces, sort of connecting with what's happening in Africa. First of all, I'm the co-founder of PropTech Africa. So it's philanthropics. It's the Association of PropTechs in Africa, which was set up in October 2019. A couple of months before COVID, but we did get quite lots of good traction over the last year, and it's giving us a lot of visibility of seeing actually what's happening across the continent. So as you would know, very often we talk about Africa as if it's one country, but it's 54 countries, very, very different, from a language perspective, English speaking, French speaking, Portuguese speaking, Italian speaking, Spanish speaking. I mean, you name it, it's all there basically. And then culturally, very, very different countries in terms of how they do business, obviously. So if you look at the continent, South Africa has got a very good ecosystem. And I think on the panel before ours, there were, I think, 1 or 2 South African friends who were on the panel as well, talking about what's been happening in South Africa. But I think South Africa is sort of interesting because it's a market which is slightly more sophisticated than the other African countries. Yeah. But having said that, I think if you look at the other countries in Africa, if you look at the brick and mortar on a standalone basis, even before we bring the tech into that space, it's only the last 10 or 15 years we've started having property, what you would call grade A properties in New York or London, etc. It's only the last 15 years. For example, we've seen this in Africa. We've had our first shopping mall in Nigeria, bustling Nigeria, was 2007. The first in Accra in Ghana was 2008. So it's very nascent. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at your part of the world, obviously you've got 100 years of history in terms of the built environment, to get to today. And today you're sort of thinking about sustainability, you're thinking about climate change, you're thinking about impact locally in the local community, etc. I think this is what we're seeing in Africa is, on our side, we've got the ability to leverage on all these today and not wait 100 years down the road, basically. So already these items which you were talking about, I think Michelle was talking about the construction flow workflows in the built environment. We're already seeing that as well on our side, because as you know, construction prices are just going up the roof. And I mean, we don't think it's going to go down to where it used to be in 2019. So what does it mean? It's forcing people to actually using data to procure locally. You know, who's the best guy downtown who can produce aluminium, you know, who can produce brick, etc. So today you can do that through data, which wasn't able to do, you know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, because we didn't have access to data. We didn't have access to even an iPhone, an iPad, etc. Today we're getting there. Yeah. So I think as we go over the panel, you know, would love to talk more about this. Is I think on our side, I'm seeing what I saw 20 years ago in the telephony space, you know, and for me, this is very remarkable because in the telephony space, early 2000, there was no landline in Africa as such. You know, making a call from two countries, from Ghana to Togo, which are neighbors, you know, the call had to go for France and back, or UK and back, basically. I mean, just to give you an indication. And then we saw how mobile telephony, basically from 2003 onwards, brought a different element to Africa on the telephony space, where we didn't have to put in the, you know, huge telephone lines as you did, you know, or other parts of the world did for the last 100 years. Yeah. So I think in the built environment, we are seeing already amazing startups coming up. And the interesting thing is, these are startups being promoted by Africans. And I'm a big proponent of bringing, pushing Africans to bring solutions to African problems, because our problems are very unique, by the way, extremely unique. Yeah. On the previous panel, somebody was talking about load shedding power, you know, which is happening in South Africa. You know, you've got load shedding for an hour or two, but in Nigeria, it's basically part of life. So that's why we're saying, you know, we need to have our own Africans, obviously, to be tuned with the bigger world, but we need our own youngsters to be able to come up with their own solutions, because they know what are the problems they're dealing on a daily basis. Yeah. So look forward to talk more about that later on. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Very interesting to hear the insights and the trends from different perspectives. Let's dive a bit more into the ESG and in the offices side, because we're all, you know, familiar with offices. There's a lot of things happening in that space, also going open or being more hybrid or being even close. In Asia, for example, right now, where a lot of ships are waiting to go into the harbor in China. So that also has some big impact on different levels. The study says that ESG offices priced 25% above non-ESGs. The anticipated premium for green and ESG-focused offices buildings is already being seen according to a study of the US rents and the sales pricing over 10 years by Cushman & Wakefield. Daniel, what kind of shifts do you observe, and especially in Canada, and from what you see on the government side?
Yeah, very interesting, actually. In terms of building use, what we're seeing that they're still trying to figure it out. Really, what we're seeing is that we haven't in 2 years reoccupied the buildings. We've been operating buildings mostly empty. And there's a movement now to come back in and have a different type of hybrid workplace, as you mentioned. And so there's a lot of opportunity there to reconfigure workspaces, you know, not create zones where a certain government department works separately from another one. Is just mixed in together. You can, you know, book your spot to work. We're doing this with our own office. We're also seeing a move towards getting away from leasing floor spaces and leveraging their own crown assets. And the reason for that is because, well, people aren't going to use buildings as much anymore. If they're only at the office a couple times a week, then we don't need as much office space. And what they found during COVID is that it's much easier to operate your own buildings differently. So in other words, we're adding more outdoor air and whatnot than it is in a leased building when you're dealing with a landlord, and there's a lot more negotiation. So the trend we're seeing is densification, reduced floor space, and they're moving towards that. The thing that I'm wondering is, it seems to be something that's constantly shifting, and what we were thinking 6 months ago, where people were going to be back about a couple days a week, 2 to 3 days a week, I think it's moved now that people are going to go in maybe a couple days a month. And I think the real estate market is still very much shifting sands when it comes to office.
Mm-hmm.
And what I predict, and this is a prediction, it's not, but I predict that a lot of office buildings will become available for new uses. And what I think we're going to see is we have a huge shortage in where I live, in the province where I live. We have a huge shortage of housing. It's one of the lowest in like per person of units. I think we're going to need to shift towards that. I think we're going to see that combined with vertical farming and a lot of integrated multi-use. It's going to be interesting though, because everyone's evacuated our center cities. People want to live in the suburbs, work from home.
Mm-hmm.
So will people come back? I think, and I know this isn't so much technology, but it's really where are things moving. The last thing I want to bring up, which just goes more about the ESG side of things. So that's the trends I'm seeing in terms of the use of buildings. On the federal government, they don't think about, they own their assets for a very, very, very long time. They don't think about the value of the asset and what they could sell it for. What they think about is life cycle costing. I'm going to own and operate this building for 25 years, 40 years, 50 years. What is it going to cost me? And let's make it green so that it's cost effective and it's a good place for people to work. So we're trying to be fiscally responsible as well. I think they're going to have to think a little bit more about the value, because they're going to dispose of a lot of buildings. And by disposing a lot of buildings, they could get a higher value for those buildings if they're already sustainable buildings. But it's again, I don't know if that's gonna happen, because it depends on what the developers want to do with the buildings in that respect. So
are they a lounging customer, Daniel? Because government in that way, they say, hey, we have to do something. But then they wait, or it takes a long time till they act. And because I worked on I think it was 2014, on a project for transformational innovation to get the buildings from the Dutch government more sustainable.
Yeah.
I advised them. They didn't eat my advice because it was transformational. And now we see they are moving, but we're now 2022. So are they acting? Are they practicing what they're preaching?
So it's we're still hoping for some additional funding to help us put things in place. We have good plans in place, and we now actually have some metrics related to delivering on these things. But putting the money where we've got certain buildings that are going through massive retrofits. They are doing it. They are actually doing it. The challenge is the buildings that don't have major capital projects planned, where we're saying, okay, to achieve 80% reduction, you need to do X, Y, Z, and we can do it in a fiscally responsible way. Getting the capital for that is very challenging.
Yeah.
So
how is that for you, Michelle? Because you're also working very close with Oxford Properties. What do you observe in related to ESG? And also, is Oxford Properties, are they acting on those topics to get that more high valued pricing on ESG buildings?
I can't talk specifically about their strategy, but in the venture space and from the owners I've talked to, including Oxford, ESG is very top of mind. So in a lot of conversations that I have, I do a lot of diligence and try to figure out where's the next tech opportunity. And this is definitely a space. I think I found it to be important across the value chain. So from owners to general contractors, like you mentioned, kind of the new builds, like what are we going to do going forward for new buildings? But also, you're right, what do you do with the existing ones? When you think of office specifically, this area is in so much flux. And I think right now, that's an interesting trend around rent increases related to ESG, and I do think we're going to see more of that. But I think right now what companies are trying to figure out is what is the footprint that they need and where is it. So the Bay Area, so I'm in the Bay Area, we're kind of delayed, I think, on the back to office compared to, say, places like New York. But Google and Apple and some of the large players have kind of announced that people are going back in. So we're seeing the Google bus go down the highway. So I think right now in the Bay Area, we're really testing out like what's going to happen. When are people going to go into the office? What's going to be that norm? And then that's going to determine what space people need. And I've also found from early stage companies, so I also talk to a lot of founders that are just starting up because I'm curious what's going to be the trend going forward. Are we all just going to be remote companies with offsites? Because I think that that's also a big opportunity for commercial real estate because the office it could make a lot of sense to have space that's just for offsites. We've seen Salesforce kind of look into something like this. So I'm curious to see what happens on the offsite front. But other companies that are just starting out, they do want space. So I think that's also important. It may be flexible space, like a co-working, but they do want to collaborate with their team from companies I've talked to. So I think when we're thinking about, there's the large tech companies which take up a lot of space in the news of what are they going to do between remote, and we often hear hybrid is kind of where people are landing. But we also need to think of the next generation of companies and what they're looking for. So that's why I think really investing in the office and focusing on ESG initiatives, which could create a premium in rent, will be worthwhile in the long term.
For me, just an observation from the Dutch, from a Dutchman. I feel office is really something from the old industry, with the pyramids. And I always say, maybe I can't say it, but pyramids creating mummies, So, but now, so do we have to get rid of those offices and say, hey, it's a facility, because we're not going to work there and behind our typing machine, because we're working on a different way. So why don't we get rid of the office and say, hey, we need a facility? And yeah, that was a former office, but yeah, okay, because you want to meet, you want to collaborate, you want to meet people, you want to have, you want to do workshops. Is that something you observe, or do you say, no, we really need an office to work, to get things done, to create our proposals, our code? What do you observe?
I think it really depends. It depends on markets. I thought a year ago, frankly, I thought we're going to move. A lot of us are going to move full-time remote. And as you know, a lot of companies actually made really bold statements in 2020, like, never come back to the office, et cetera. The last couple of weeks I was in Europe, for example, it's sort of interesting to see how the city of London, people who work in the financial services think in the city of London, as opposed to people in Paris, for example. Very different, very different. The Parisians want to get back to the office. It's culture. They need to get back to the office. They need to be together. They need to be in the crowded space, etc. That's very French,
Is that the culture? Really, the culture?
I think it's culture. I think it's culture. I mean, it's sort of interesting because in the city of London, for example, they're sort of into two minds. The full-time remote, no. I think they're now to sort of 3 days, 2 days. And the discussion now is, how do you structure the 3 days? Do you give it to anybody to come in anytime? Or do you basically say Monday to Wednesday compulsory in the office, because so that you have that kind of interaction, and then Thursday, Friday, you just basically work from home or whatever, yeah? So I think my sort of feel is it's going to take probably another year or two for people to get the right mix. Having said that, I think for some of the industries, it makes sense. If you're in the tech industry, for example, you were probably remote even pre-COVID, most likely, So it doesn't change anything in your lifestyle, doesn't change anything in your work life, etc. But if you look at, for example, which is interesting because I had this discussion with a with a couple of law firms in London. It's very difficult because, you know, in the law firms, you need the junior people who start working in the law firm. They need to be next to the senior guys, you know, every single day. You know, watch how you negotiate and how you do deals, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for some of these service lines, it's going to be hard because you need that social interaction as well, you know. And then the other point is which I've seen as well on my side is generational. Obviously, there's a clear trend. You know, the older you are, the more you want to get to the office. You know, something like that. Yep. Okay. Now, I think there's no. This is my view. I think there's no prescribed sort of, you know, formula that's going to work. I think it's up to corporates, to enterprises, to individuals to find the right space, basically, you know, to find whether, you know, it makes sense to be full-time or not. Now, on the question of just to give you a perspective in our markets in Africa, in South Africa, like I mentioned, it's more sophisticated, etc. So in the main cities in South Africa, there's an oversupply of offices, and that these oversupply were already there pre-COVID, because there's been a lot of money that's been poured into the construction of new office buildings, especially your, you know, premium grade, with all your ESG flashpoints, basically, pre-COVID. Now, in South Africa, there's an oversupply. Obviously, the big question is pressure on rental. And then also, what do you do with your old stocks, your B grade and your C grade? So what we're seeing already, we're seeing a number of things: conversion into accommodation, conversion into more so, you know, flexible work office space, basically. And I think, I can't remember if it's Michelle, I think Daniel mentioned about vertical farming as well. So this is also being explored now because, you know, there's huge pressure now on agriculture, globally speaking, logistics, etc. So it's almost like bringing agriculture back to source, to where you are. So I think we're going to see that as well. Now, that's South Africa. Now, the rest of Africa, which is interesting because the rest of Africa, we've been lagging. So even pre-COVID, there wasn't sufficient supply of office space in the market. In fact, we were sort of like, you know, on the catch-up game, basically, trying to catch up, So the interesting thing now, what's happening, people now are saying, okay, now we've got COVID. People from, you know, developed world are saying maybe remote, half remote or whatever, flexi time, etc. So what's interesting now, the discussion around in Africa now is about what's the right mix of office space in downtowns, traditional downtowns, So again here, I think it's an opportunity for these African countries because of the lagging factor. They're able to basically make the best decision and not overbuild and then try to figure out what to do next. So we are seeing mixed use development. Like I've talked about accommodation, students accommodation, you know, all these kind of things coming up. So it's going to be interesting to see over the next couple of years how that's going to pan out.
It will be very interesting. One thing which pops up in my head is we can stop constructing new buildings because we first have to figure out and how to optimize the use of the existing ones. But I also know that in Africa and in Asia, there will be a lot of construction in the next decade. Daniel, something you want to add in this?
I found the whole exchange interesting about the different perspectives, and Menno, you mentioned, you know, the pyramid and how that's changing. And if people follow me on LinkedIn, I write a lot about, or I post a lot about either carbon sustainability, but also very much about employee engagement and leadership. And one of the exchanges I've had with one of our senior VPs recently on LinkedIn is about how talent has won, and that we have to adapt to talent. We are having in Canada tremendous difficulty retaining and hiring people. And what people want is they want full flexibility. They mostly want to work from home. That's what we're seeing. And we're seeing that employers who are not fully embracing that, and we're seeing employers that are actually saying, yeah, you can work wherever you want. But recently I saw a post that said something like, yeah, it's a hybrid work place. So after 5, you can work from home, which is completely bonkers. I think our Gen Z, Gen Z is our bunch of
You
idiots.
can work from 9 to 5, you know, but from Monday to Friday. That's
and that's the thing, is I think the old corporate pyramid needs to change. And the thing is that now employees have the power, you know, and we need to treat them well. And they don't even want like huge pay. They just want to be treated well and treated honestly. And what we're seeing here is people want to work from home. That's the major trend. And I think the trend is changing monthly. And we're seeing it move here in Canada, move towards that. It's interesting to hear that in Paris they want to be together, and I understand that. I'm French Canadian. I suffered greatly when COVID first hit. I found other ways to get my social interaction now, but I suffered greatly by not being with those people. It's going to be really interesting to see the shifting tides, but employees right now have a lot of power because there's way more demand for their talent than there are available talents.
Yeah. So we have now the pyramid. It was like this, but now it's like that. Turn it around and more being a servant leader. Is that facilitating leadership, empowering the people instead of telling them what to do?
Exactly. And I think it's going to take a little while because I think there's some generational changes that need to happen.
Yeah. I also, I think it's also a nice hook because the whole ESG social impact, and when you look at ESG compliance, it's getting more and more important for companies' long-term success. We know that the companies who are focusing on ESG have a better performance in that way. I see that more and more startups or young tech companies creating their value proposition related to ESG. I also read that only 7% of the startups, I don't talk about PropTech startups, but startups as a whole, as in general, have a net zero plan. Just 7%. So that's it's getting somewhere. But Michelle, you're working for OMERS Ventures, multi-stage, multi-sector venture capital with offices in Palo Alto, Toronto, and London, and you're leading the PropTech space. What role does ESG play in the due diligence process of startups at OMERS Ventures, and especially in PropTech? And do you see differences between US, Canada, and Europe or UK?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that in 2 ways. So one, just thinking about ESG in general and the startups that are focused on that space. So these are companies that are building technology to help traditional players manage ESG processes. There's a lot of data that needs to be acquired or tracked that maybe wasn't necessarily tracked before. So we're seeing a lot of discussions, I would say, in North America about what to build and what makes sense. Europe is definitely further ahead. Like they have a much more.
I didn't hear that. But
oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. But I just repeat that last sentence.
Okay. I was saying that North America, specifically the US, we're seeing companies start to think about ESG, early stage companies. But there's still a lot of unknowns around regulation, what to track, what needs to be reported. Whereas in Europe, there's a little bit more clarity there. So my expectation is that we're going to see companies further along, technology companies further along coming from Europe in this case. Since we're Series A, B, and C, usually these companies have already been around for a while. They're getting close to product market fit.
Yeah. So
I would expect that the next wave of companies, which we already have seen, will be Europe first, and then we'll probably see some that are in North America. They're kind of right now, I would say, are just emerging and trying to figure out the problems to solve, which is exciting. I think there's also some existing technology that can be used for ESG, so those companies are further along. But I do see that Europe has the lead here. And it's interesting having the different geographies to kind of know different areas of technology where you'll see leading indicators in an industry.
Yeah.
The second part of your question around just our diligence process to any deal related to ESG, this is something that's important to OMERS. And I think we're starting to see this across other funds and managers of capital, just the importance of ensuring that a lot of our companies, even if they're not ESG specific tech companies, but any type of investment are really ESG conscious. So it is part of our diligence process now.
Yeah. What I see, when I talk with the real estate industry and with the tech companies, the real estate company can say, hey, how can you contribute to my ESG goals? But that's more a partnership, a more scope 3 relationship in that way. But what I also observe, but it's very tiny development, I think, or tiny trend, is that they're going to ask, hey, how can you help me as a customer to contribute to my ESG targets on social and government, different things? But also, what is your policy internally? So how do you take care of diversity and inclusion? How do you take care of what do you want? What's your tax policy? Maybe that's a big question, or maybe. But also, how do you reduce energy with your employees? How do you take care that the data server is reducing their energy? So it's more and that last one is internally on the startup is really very in the underground, but something is moving. Do you see the same, or don't see it yet? What do you? No.
I agree with what you're saying. I think some of the larger companies, like big players, are making estimates of what their contribution will be to the environment in 10 years or something. And they're promoting that we're going to get to X by this time, which is amazing. But I think the next question is, how do you know in 1 year, or 2 years, or 3 years if you're on track? And also, are you going to make it there? And I think that is an area that is very new. And I think being able to, just like you said, making sure that even if our traditional investments are being compliant to certain regulations or just being aware of it, you kind of starts at the bottom up, and it has to be part of your culture. And then you can kind of move to hitting some of these milestones eventually.
Yeah. Kevin, how is it in Africa? Is ESG also part of the startup community in Africa, or maybe only in South Africa?
Well, it's sort of interesting, because if you haven't been in Africa, you would say, why should we bother with ESG? Because we've got so many other struggles that we've got on the ground to fight for every day, etc. But you'll be surprised. I mean, ESG has been on the agenda for more than 10 years, and I'll link that to what Michelle just said. Is a lot of it is basically because most of the private equity funds, most of the investment funds are Europeans. And they came in with that sort of guidelines, So 10 years ago, it was probably a couple of boxes that you had to tick, just as a KYC. But over the last 5 years, we are seeing positive changes where basically now the developers themselves, the service providers, etc., they themselves are embracing ESG in the corporate culture. I mean, to give you a more precise example, for my sins, I would say I chair the board of 2 resorts, Radisson Blues in Mauritius, which is off the mainland Africa. But we've got ESG as well. Many years ago, be it whether it's solar panels, be it whether it's recycling food that you use, etc., minimizing food wastage, using local service providers, and all that stuff. So all these now are becoming basically the norm, and I think we should push that as much as possible. Yeah. Now, on the other hand,
Kevin, do you think that, because I believe that's also why I started PropTech For Good is we have global challenges but local solutions, and why do we have to reinvent the wheel? Do you think Africa or African countries can be an example for Western countries to learn how to take care of the waste, how to take care of the food, and that kind of things?
I think I think it's not about sort of like teaching others, etc. I think we need each other. I don't believe in the world. I mean, I've traveled a lot in my life. I've lived in different countries, in different continents, etc. I don't believe you can take one part of the world and then enforce that in other parts of the world. And I think, that's where I'm saying, is I'll give you an example. If you take the African continent, if you look at East and Southern Africa, from an energy point of view, they are blessed because basically they've got a lot of rain, a lot of water. So hydro is the main power source, which isn't the case in many parts of the world, in maybe even your parts of the world, etc. Now, if you look at West Africa, Nigeria, it's not the case because they're not blessed with water, so they have to use oil. And despite being producer of oil, a lot of companies in West Africa, unfortunately, can't rely on the government electricity company. So what happens is when you build a building, you have to inbuilt a generator which will work full time to produce your own power, and then on the back of that, you've got another generator as a backup to the first one. So you can imagine the cost and the inefficiency of that in West Africa. And we've gone through that. So now the thing is, we are seeing money coming in into the energy space in Africa because we've got a lot of natural gas in that part of the world. We are also seeing money coming in. Basically, we're also blessed with, given where the continent is, with a lot of sunshine as well. If you can have solar panels in Germany where you've got sunlight, a very small percentage, you should have it in Africa. So we are seeing all these coming down. Now, having said that, I think, I'll probably use this forum as a message is, I think let's say from Europe or elsewhere, the investors should look at Africa and say, okay, you know what? We've got an opportunity here because we're starting with a clean sheet. We don't need to go for all the mistakes that we've gone in the West in terms of building and wrongly built and turning, etc. Let's give them the best thing, the best tools, and also let's give them access to the best funding. The problem of Africa currently is funding availability. I mean, we've got the most vibrant continent, we've got a vibrant youth coming up, we've got so much resources, etc. But it's just basically the lack of funding. I mean, there's more funding today than 10 years ago, but the funding is very pricey. I mean, I'll tell you which is not normal to me. I mean, I've been in the banking space, etc. It's not normal for an African country to borrow 10-year money at 12% on the dollar, when Joe Blogg in Paris, who earns €2,000, can borrow 30-year money at 1.5%. So this is where the message I'm sending here to my European friends, to my American friends, is how do we, especially these days, by the way, because there's a big geopolitical shift happening in the world, and Africa needs to choose, and Africa will choose a side. But to choose the right side, the strategic partners need to sort out the funding issue. If that's done, it's going to unlock a lot of things for Africa, and it's going to unlock a lot of things even for the rest of the world, especially Europe and North America as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. We have 5 minutes left, and I definitely want to ask Daniel one question before we go to the last tip question. In that way, Daniel, social procurement, because that's also very important when we talk about ESG. What's the big trend right now? What do you observe?
Yeah, so I'm going to separate private and public tendering. So on the private side, with our private clients, we've had a lot more flexibility to impose sustainability requirements in terms of whether it's products or corporate governance and whatnot, the ESG. And I've actually shared a few links that can be shared with the group about some of the awards we've received from that. And this is really driven is by our CEO, who is really, really passionate about sustainability. On the public side, we are moving towards more inclusive, indigenous, sustainable procurement. The challenge is that we can't exclude anyone from bidding just because they don't have an indigenous content and all that, because it's public money. So what we're doing is we actually have people who are engaged. We have an Indigenous director, and I'll use that as an example, but it fits in with everything else. And what he does is he connects with Indigenous-led businesses and says, "Okay, there's a lot of work with the federal government. You have to compete for it, but here's how you do it." And we're teaching them how to engage with government and how to get business with government. And that's been the single most important thing is to. And I really like it because we're not handing out work to minority groups. We're saying, here's a fair shot at getting this work. And the more of these minority groups that we attract to the bidding process and they learn how to compete, the better it is for us as a whole. Because they don't want to hand out. They want to do it in their best way. On the sustainability front, we're really just pressing, like, you want to do business with us, you want to do cleaning products, they all have to be green, natural products. Like, it's a non-starter. Like, we do not use chemical products. We've convinced a lot of our clients to go away from pesticides and all these different things that we've done, and that's been really, really pushed. So from our perspective, we're pushing it big time, and that's really driven by our CEO. And it's been a differentiator for us in the industry, to be honest.
Yeah. Awesome. Really, really great. I really like that approach. Last question, and we really almost running out of time. So there are 10,000 solutions in the world, on the market. I suppose you are an owner of a property portfolio. Given your experience in the market, can you give one golden tip for property owners to be successful in the selection and implementation of the process? Michelle, can I start with you? One golden tip.
Be proactive, not reactive. So instead of seeing things come in and assessing them, be very clear of what problem you're trying to solve, and then go out and find the ones that are doing it.
Awesome. Thank you. Kevin, your golden tip?
I would say, given where we are today, be open-minded. Think outside the box, basically, and just be ready to be surprised by what's coming up.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. Daniel?
Well, my advice is there's a lot of technology out there, and I'm going to borrow from Einstein. So if you have 60 minutes to implement a new technology, spend 50 minutes figuring out if it's the right technology or if it's snake oil, and then implement the best solutions. And a lot of the best solutions are simple.
Awesome. Great end of this session. Thank you, Gavin, Daniel, and Michelle for sharing your experience. And thank you for having me. And I wish you all a great summit and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.